It's Supernal Magazine radio time here with your host, Anthony Kilner. I hope everybody out there in listener land's doing really well. We have our usual co-hosts in Freya Sampson from over in WA and Shirley down on the Mornington Peninsula. Good morning, Freya. How are you?
I'm fabulous. Grand risings, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful, beautiful day in the world.
It is actually not a bad day, I have to admit. It's not bucketing with rain and it's not windy, so that's always good. Shirley, down on the peninsula, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. It's really nice down here, actually. Yesterday got very, very muggy and hot in the afternoon and evening, and beautiful full moon, which I sat out and
it was
the skies.
Yes,
and
it was.
It's just nice here today. It's just in between.
We have a special guest today that I've actually been looking forward to catching up with for quite some time. And I know he's been a very busy man and it's been really tricky. And the last time we really spoke was, believe it or not, late-ish 2019. And we're really happy to have Damon Gameau, and I hope I said that right, who is an actor who put out That Sugar film and who put his body under amazing pressure doing that documentary film. He's also produced 2040, which we promoted in the December 2019 issue of the magazine. So that's how long ago it's been. And now you've got a new film, Damon, coming out called Regeneration Australia. We'll get to that in a sec. But Damon, welcome to Supernal Magazine Radio.
Thank you for having me, Anthony, and everyone, and good to be back. And just thinking how much the world has changed since we last discussed. My gosh, only a couple of years ago, and yet we've been through fires and pandemics and all sorts of things. So lots to discuss. Yeah.
Well, and a part of our thing, apart from Regenerate Australia, is we were having a chat the other day about the environment and environmental issues, that also we're talking about bees. So we're going to come back and we'll talk about bees and the environment, because that's going to be our January issue for 2021-22. So there's a lot to discuss. But last time we spoke, you had a new bub. How's the family going?
Yeah, very well. We've, I guess, one of the real silver linings of the last 18 months for us has been me not traveling at all. And so to really deeply connect with the family has been exactly what I didn't realize I needed until it happened. And we have two daughters, one's 8 and the second one is now 2. And just to be able to spend that kind of quality time together and really put that true work in with the family has been very restorative and transformative for us as a family, which we're very grateful for.
No, that's great. So talk us through Regenerate Australia.
Yeah, so it sort of came as a response after the fires in early 2020. So after the fires had been through in that summer, and we were approached by WWF and a few other organisations who, I guess, really understood that there was some potency in narrative in how do we actually create a story of how these communities might be able to rebuild, and how do we help them to do that. And then obviously the pandemic hit, which added this extra layer and really threw people into chaos, as we know. And so we did a 4-month interview exercise of almost 1,000 Australians from very different parts of the country, often many in the bushfire affected areas, but also Indigenous groups, conservative farmers, inner city corporate types, and got a sense of, right, if we emerge from this time, what kind of changes would we want to see in this country? What would it look like? Are there opportunities that we can use here? William Gibson had a terrific quote that said to experience a crisis is to inhabit a world that is temporarily up for grabs. So what is the new story that we'd want to tell out of this time? And so based on that feedback, I sort of put together this film, which is only a 20-minute film, but it's set as a news report in 2030 or New Year's Eve on 2029. And it's a look back at the remarkable decade of regeneration that Australia would go through, and deliberately used very identifiable voices and messengers like Kerry O'Brien and Sandra Sully and Georgie Coughlin and Mike Tomalaris, all these voices that people are very familiar with, but we reconstructed or constructed these news stories and press conferences and interviews with people in community and lots of visual effects to show what it would be like and how would it feel to implement these changes, from First Nations voice to Parliament, to restoring and regenerating our landscapes, to decentralising our energy, to changing our governance models and participatory democracy, and let people feel that. And then the plan is to roll that out across the country in February and March next year, but with a really extensive impact campaign that includes curriculum materials for schools, but more importantly has a multi-million-dollar fund where communities, if they see a solution they resonate with, can apply for a grant to start that solution. So it might be a community battery in your region, but at the moment the feasibility study might be $60,000 or $70,000. So there's grants from $5,000 to $150,000 to get communities going. So the whole premise is a community-led recovery, that we can't keep relying on the federal government for action. We have to show our leaders how to lead, and the way we're going to regenerate our eco and our social systems is from the grassroots. That's how nature does it. We've got to start in our communities and from the ground. And that was the number one word that came up in our research right around the country, was people want more empowerment in their community again. They're sick of decisions being made for them from people that live a long way from their regions. And they want models and tools and sovereignty around their energy and their food and their manufacturing. And they want their ecosystems and their communities to thrive again. So that's the motivation behind it, pulling in a lot of really interesting groups, and think the timing is going to be interesting. I think so far we've got a really wonderful reception to the film. So I think it might cut through because people are desperately looking for actionable ways through these very difficult times.
I think that what you've just hit on is so important, especially down here in Melbourne, because of everything that's been going on down here. And we've had the fires and we've had the floods, we pandemic stuff that's been going on. Our governance has been less than good in a whole lot of ways. And, I think people are looking for a change, and I think moving into next year is probably perfect timing to bring about change. Yes, Shelley.
Oh, WWF, World Wildlife Fund, correct?
Yeah.
That's so good, because for so many years I've always had an automatic donation coming out every month, and you get caught up in thinking you don't see the bigger picture in it. And I think that's really good, because people now can see where their money is coming back and what's actually doing. It's not just save a bear, which is so important to me anyway, which is why I do it, but they're going to see the bigger picture, and it's really good for a very big corporation, fund, whatever it is, coming in to support and actually assist in bringing change. That's a biggie.
Yeah, I think a lot of these organisations, and everyone really, is kind of what COVID has pushed up for everyone, is the systemic flaws and the fragility of this big system that we've created. And that really it's not enough to just tinker around the edges anymore and try and raise a little bit of money to save the koalas or whatnot. We might preserve some, but we need to acknowledge the flawed architecture of this system that is driving the decimation of these habitats, that is driving the fractured democracies, that's driving things like climate change. They're all linked, and they all come back to the same cogs or the same engine. And I think people are really seeing that now. And it's just not enough to just, try and tinker at the edges. We've got to really think seriously about what our incentives are to this system, what's driving them, who's making the decisions, and what kind of behaviours are we bringing out in people, because it's not working and we're all feeling that. And we're getting feedback from that system, and any system that doesn't respond to that feedback perishes. So this is our moment. It's like our own. You get feedback from your body, and if you respond to it, then you can heal yourself. But if you ignore that feedback, we all know where that ends up. And the Earth system, the Gaia, whatever you want to call it, is giving us that feedback right now. And it's incumbent on us to change if we want to keep inhabiting this beautiful planet.
Yeah, I resonate completely with everything that you're saying, Damon. I've been involved in projects for decades, and what I found has always been when you can take disparate groups that are trying to work on something, and then you can bring them together to under an umbrella organisation or an umbrella vision, then that's the point when you really get traction. One of the projects I worked on was Roman art groups in the Pilbara, and we had like 4 disparate art groups getting nowhere. As soon as we brought them together, within 6 months, there was $750,000 worth of grants, donations, land, all sorts of stuff put into the reinvigoration of culture in that area. And your documentary feels, it has that same energy of really bringing everyone together and getting them on track. And I'm really excited.
Well, that's right. And I think it's, I'm very careful to say, look, this, like with 2040, it's not my vision. It was like a consultation with 130 kids around the world about what kind of world they want to live in. And it's the same with this one. It's, it was very tricky to curate some of those views and find the common ground. But what was very heartening was to hear how many things we have in common, despite what our news feeds and our algorithms tell us. We actually are deeply united. And I think that even, the people that really go and take to the streets, or conspiracy theories that might emerge, whatever you want to call it, that only happens because people want a better world. So we're actually, again, very united in all calling out the flaws of this system. We have our own unique ways of how we think we could fix it. But where we can find that unity is to say we're not being met. Our needs aren't being met. We're not getting the connection that we actually need as human beings. So the opportunity is to find those visions or those stories that can unite us. And they won't be perfect, but they're going to be a lot better than what we're dealing with right now. And so I think that's the opportunity. And that's, again, from my experience, what film can do in a beautiful way is bring together lots of different groups or organizations under a tent or an umbrella where they can have these conversations and think about meaningful ways to work together and move forward. And I would argue that's, largely how we've always operated. We inhabit a human story, a collective human story. And that's changed over history. And it's not serving us anymore. The story we have right now is that we're largely selfish and greedy, and that nature's separate from us, and that we have to grow our economy at all costs. Well, that is a story, and it's a new story in the history of our species. So now's the time to rewrite that, because that's taking us to the precipice of an unimaginable crisis. Who are the new storytellers? Which voices are we going to promote? Who needs to be heard that hasn't been heard before? What are the new metaphors? All that is the work to be done right now that I find incredibly exciting, and often not talked about enough. It's the deeper layers. It's not just about renewable energy. It's actually the technology we need is our hearts and minds and our imagination. That's the real tech we've got to push to the forefront in this moment.
Yeah, I totally agree, Shelley.
Yeah, well, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, your journey and what you've done, and starting with the sugar film, it's starting from the ground up with our body, assisting people in realising and looking at their bodies and what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing, and assisting them in that way, and then how that grew, into helping in schools and communities. And I see the films are threading together. They're making a weave, and then into 2040, and since that film came out over the years, which year was it that came out?
2019.
Was 2019. Over those couple of years now, it's like it comes up in conversation. So many things that you brought into the film have come up in conversation in different ways that people have actually commented on and seen, and I've had discussions with them about it. It's been really good. So this next one, Regeneration Australia, and you mentioned how you've used familiar faces and looking back on where we've come since 2019, say till now. That's really interesting, because I want to ask, when you were putting that together, how did you come up with what to reveal?
Great question. Yeah, look, I think, and this was obviously lessons learned from 2040 too, that this idea of the images that we are putting into the collective hive mind of us as a species are so important, and we've neglected that, or some of them have been deliberately manipulative. That, any vision of the future, if you ask most children, is this kind of apocalyptic world devoid of any nature. Humans are slaves to robots, and we're being chased around in slums. And if we keep putting that imagery out there, we are going to manifest that to a degree, or that's the future we're going to build. So we do need an intervention, I think, on some of that imagery about these different worlds that we could build. And we're seeing that right now. There's this resurgence of people starting to conjure up, what wilding our cities would look like, putting animals and nature back through the concrete and removing cars and making walkways and actually connecting ourselves to nature through our habitats. Like, and you can feel like when you see that, people feel like, gosh, that'd be beautiful to live in. So this idea of imagery, I think, is really important. And that's, again, what informed this new film, was using that as a way to entice people and to get them to dream, because we forget to dream. We're not dreaming enough. We're not pondering. We outsource all of this stuff. Most of us operate every moment of our lives with a podcast in our ear or something else, that we're just receiving data streams the whole time, that we're not actually stopping and doing our own conjuring and dreaming. So I think that's why this film is an encouragement. And what was so beautiful about it were all the mock interviews that we did with hundreds of people saying, hey, okay, it's 2027. This has happened in your community. How does that make you feel? And just seeing the willingness of people to sit in that space. And many of them got very emotional. And they'd say afterwards, gosh, I spend so much time on the now or reflecting on my past. I haven't done this before. I haven't actually smelt or dreamt or imagined or felt what that world would be like. And I just think that's so important. We've got to do all those things, and we've really neglected that part. So, but to your question, of these 1,000 people that we interviewed, we then catalogued all of their responses, found consensus. And as I said before, the number one word that came up was community. And then tried to craft this narrative based on what these people want. And what, again, was encouraging was that many of the conservative farmers, for example, they might not have been saying the words climate change or climate action, but they were saying greener hills again, cleaner rivers, an Australia of 30 years ago that I remember. That's what I want for the future. So it was about trying to read beneath and get a sense of what people's needs were and how could we meet those needs with this future. And of course, there's going to be things in there that people are going to discuss. Not everyone's going to agree with a First Nations voice to Parliament in some capacity. But great, let's at least have that conversation, because at the moment we're just sort of listless. We're stuck in this sort of future that's being shaped for us by governments and corporations that we don't necessarily agree with. So let's at least reclaim our power to a degree by having a robust discussion as citizens who live in this country about where it's headed, because we're forgetting to do that. And we have untold power when we understand that we get to shape it. We get to tell our leaders what future we want. And I think we've forgotten that. So that's what the idea of this is, just to try and cut through and remind people of that and get them into packed cinemas and have great discussions, and then think about what solution would be applicable for their region and giving them the means to build it, and not just feel like a utopian fantasy that can't happen, but say, no, here's a tangible pathway for you to create that in your community. So go and have that discussion with them, do some dreaming in your own region, and then apply for that money. And who knows where that could lead. But it just shifts the mindset from feeling overwhelmed, paralyzed by the fear, victimized. This is all too hard. It's too existential. So no, we can be the change. Let's go. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's stop waiting for our leaders, and let's show them how to lead.
Yeah, I think we've got to remember that we are a being who existed in nature prior to the advent of agriculture, prior to the advent of architecture and these extraordinary cities that have been built across the world. And if you look at them from an aerial view, then what you're really looking at is a circuit board, and all of the people and all of the cars are carrying the program, and there's no trees, and they become disassociated from their own nature. And if we could as a community bring some of that nature back in, as you say, walkways and things where there's wildlife in the city, then it keeps you in frequency with that, which means that the decision-making process of the people in those places and in those roles is going to become more balanced and more harmonized with the nature of what a human being really is. And then that filters out into the suburbs, and then into the country is communicating, the rural regions are communicating with the city. And what an incredible world we might have, where we could have the best of all worlds then.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful statement. And there are really robust studies to back that up now, that once we are around nature, it lowers our fight-flight response, that, you know, even some plants are releasing bacteria and hormones that interact with us and make us feel better. You know, the doctors in Scotland now are legally allowed to prescribe walks in nature for their patients, you know. So there's this growing rapid awareness, and even this idea of wilding our cities is not a radical discussion anymore. There are legitimate councils around the world and cities that are discussing this. In fact, in China right now, there's the first forest city that is being built, and it's got millions of trees. You can hardly see any concrete, and there's no cars, and it's sequestering huge amounts of carbon. That's being built as we speak now. It's not a sci-fi fantasy. So this future is within our grasp, you know, and I think we're going to have to go through all sorts of permutations and trouble. We know that. They're unavoidable now. But I think if we can keep encouraging people that on the other side of that could be an extraordinary ecological civilization. I mean, that's a potential in 100 or 200 years. And so future historians would look back to this time and say, imagine being around then, like when the humans started this journey, like they transitioned their energy and their resources and how they treated their indigenous, and all these things happened. And God, imagine living in 2021 to be at the start of that. And so that's what keeps me going, is that we might not see that in our lifetimes, but the legacy that we might set up for the future is so beautiful if we can get it right. That harmony, restoring that harmony to our systems, to our interactions with each other, that we create a win-win system, not a win-lose system. And we go from personal gain to collective joy, you know, and what a great outcome.
I think so. For our listeners out there, we're talking with Damon Gameau about his new film that's coming out, small film, short film, Regeneration Australia, so coming out next year. I think everything you're saying and what Freya said is really important, because as you know, Damon, I've recently got some bees. We've just started with our first hive, and I know Freya's heading down that path too. One of the things that I've noticed with having the bees, and we're walking up to see them every day and we're talking to them, and when you're there, you just get this hum, and that hum I'm finding is almost like frequencies of peacefulness, you know. And you sit there, and for someone that has spent most of his life technically allergic to bees in a big way, and being around bees and hives that have been open and all the rest of it, I'm not finding any fear in that. I'm actually enjoying the experience of the bees moving around me and that peacefulness. And I think that's an important thing that you said, is about getting back and understanding what nature is doing for us. Yeah. And the changes, you know, for all the damage we're doing to it, Mother Earth is still trying to get us back on the right track. And I just really feel passionate about that. I just think it's very important. Shirley.
Yeah, this idea.
And David mentioned the hive mind in what he was talking about then, and brought it right back into there. And then you say that, and that's what you're tuning into as you're interacting, walking around your property. You're tuning into that hive mind. They're giving you their sense of community, and they're working together in that peace, and that's what that hum is.
Yeah, beautiful. So,
spot on. I think I love this idea of regeneration and how we regenerate. And, you know, I really think it's a skill we all have to hone, whether we're going to pull this incredible task off or whether we await something more cataclysmic. We're going to have to learn to regenerate. And regenerating our ecosystems starts with our own place, as you've just alluded to then. And how many of us, you know, how many people talk about trying to save the planet, yet remain so disconnected to their own tiny piece of it that they inhabit. Unless your place has meaning, unless you can hear the hum of your bees and understand the blossoms of your flowers and the wisdom on the winds, then you can't possibly save the planet. So it's almost the most important action we can all take is to reconnect with our place and teach our children about it and understand the life that's around you, and then work out from there, instead of just going straight to the top and trying to solve everything, because that won't do it. It won't be the depth that's required. It'll be a quick fix. We might lower our emissions, but we'll still have, you know, huge income inequality. We'll still be decimating bee populations. This has to be a whole system paradigm change, else it's going to be fruitless and we're going to fly off the cliff regardless.
Yeah, I think too that what you said then, the disconnect, I think people are struggling with the disconnect because they're not actually connected to themselves. And this is why it's not happening in a home space, and why that people they're focusing around. And this time there's the fear, there's money, there's insecurity, there's mental health issues, there's all these things. And so without that connect to them and to themselves, it's going to be very hard for them to then connect into their home space as it is. And that's why I think education around younger people, trying to get them into the garden instead of in front of a screen, by trying to get them outside and just helping in the garden, you know, walking around. We love having, you know, we've got multiple friends with kids, and they come around and they want to go and see the chooks and they want to see the ducks. And, you know, we've got friends now that want to go and see the bees and all this sort of stuff. And I think that's the connect that people are missing, just that, oh, I want to be in that space and make my space happy.
Yeah, and then there's a humility to that, I think, too, that when you actually do consider your place in the bigger ecosystem, it's humbling. It's incredibly humbling. And you see the bees at work, and you really understand how proficient they are. Or, you know, there was recently a discovery in Brazil of a set of underground networks that the termites had built that was the size of the UK. It was 220 million termite domes. You know, that's humbling to us as humans, that this anthropocentric sort of view that we have, that we are the masters of this planet. It's like, no. So there's something very humbling when you can connect and get in the garden and learn about the soil and all the life in there. And I think we need that as well, because this sort of us first approach and ontology is also the thing that's doing the destruction. So yeah, you can heal yourself by getting the garden, and then the ripple effect is that you develop a symbiosis with it that is exactly what the planet needs.
Shelley.
Can I ask, there is, you know, so many people say, but what can I do? I'm just one person, I can't do anything. So they give up before they even start. And we don't have to be the filmmaker, we don't have to be the activist, we don't have to be this, but there's just these tiny things. We can't all even have a garden, and they just feel so that their one self won't make a difference. And yet, going back to the original film, the sugar film, that one self testing on yourself made such a difference. And if they realize that working on their body might make one difference, what happens outside of them? It's getting into that part of the psyche, isn't it? That their very self, their place, they do have a purpose and a place. If it's one little thought, that might make a huge difference.
I love that, Shirley.
How do we get that out?
Well, you're spot on. We forget just how social we are as creatures, and this is what gives me the most hope, is that how quickly, and even historically, how things have changed so quickly, because we cultivate new norms and new patterns of behavior. And even by conversation you might have with someone, or like you said, you suddenly have a glow to you because you've changed your diet. Someone will say, oh, you look like, and then that sets off a chain of thought in their mind as well. And it's the same, we're just not talking about this stuff as much as we should. And all the studies I've read show that, you know, if someone puts even solar panels on their roof, the chances of a neighbor putting solar panels on goes up exponentially, because we actually know it's the right thing to do somewhere. So that's a thing we have that can work against us, but it's also hugely powerful once we can get that underlying story right and cultivate those new patterns of behavior and myths, and which is a lot of what the kids are pushing through now for us. And I see it in boardrooms where these CEOs are scrambling because they know these kids are going to be the consumers in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And unless they're doing the right thing legitimately, they're not going to keep them on board. So there is great potency in even a simple conversation or a post on your social media. So we've got to remember that, that we are all agents of change in a very powerful way, and not to neglect that in this moment.
And there's so many ways we can recycle and upcycle things too. Like, I mean, last night I was looking at a YouTube video on how to turn an old fridge into a worm farm, because that's what I'll be doing in my garden shortly. So there's all of this, like waste. I mean, people could start a business, collect all of the old fridges, turn them into worm farms and send them back out into the community. There's so many cool things that people can do, that just changes the whole dynamic of just that one step out of consumerism and into let's continue to utilize all of the resources. If it's finished with that purpose, how do we put it into a new purpose so that we're moderating how we care for ourselves and care for the earth and a worm fridge instead of a beer fridge.
Yeah, I actually saw a story last night about a guy in Germany who's taking old gumball machines and turning them into beehives. So there's one for your magazine. But yeah, that's the ingenuity that's available to us. And that's what gives me the most hope, is that once people really get the urgency of what's required, which is starting to happen now, humans are extraordinary in their creativity and ingenuity when their backs are against the wall. And we're seeing that right now. People haven't taken it seriously until the last probably year and a half. And now there's just this absolute flurry of activity and care for the living world, more than we've ever had before. Doesn't say we don't still have entrenched power that is doing the opposite. And there's a lot of work to be done there. But that groundswell of momentum, that sort of tipping point, I think, is not that far away, to be honest. And that's, again, how it's always worked historically. There's been a build-up of momentum, and then something has happened. Rosa Parks on a bus, a suffragettes march. Suddenly, all this work that was done before just cascades through society, and we can see change happen very, very quickly. So, that's what keeps me going, is the thought that might happen in the coming decades in a very meaningful way.
I think that's a really positive message to put out there, because it's really hard for a lot of people at the moment in the stress to see a positive somewhere. Yeah. And if that positive, just you help them to go out and grow something in a pot, a veggie or a tree or something that is, exactly, and gives them some food and gives them some pride. I think anything positive is very important at the moment.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I've done a lot of reading on this, and that's what gave me hope, was like sort of learning about the suffragettes and seeing, Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst, that they took 10 years to get 3,000 women to march. What an achievement that was. And then a few years later, even the president of America, Grover Cleveland, 1907, said, no sensible woman wants to vote. This is just a silly idea. And yet 10, 15 years later, everything changed. And it's the same with the abolitionists, that 25 years before slavery ended, most economies or countries in the world were saying, we can't give up slaves. If we give up slaves, we'll lose our economic advantage over another country. It is impossible. Exactly what we're saying now about fossil fuels. And yet, 25 years later, the entire world changed. So there are lots of precedents for this happening before. Admittedly, this is on a larger global scale, but I think we should be aware of those stories at least, and it should motivate us to keep going, because when we do get that enough consensus, enough buy-in, enough meaningful action, then I think we can transform things incredibly quickly. Rocky, admittedly, yes, people aren't going to want to give up their power. There's going to be all sorts of changes, but again, what a time to be alive, assisting in that rebirthing of a new way to operate and create a civilization.
When we were chatting the other day, Damon, we were talking about environment and bees specifically, and you were going to dig up some information and talk about some information. You've been working with a specialist person in that field?
Oh no, so Paul Hawken is an environmentalist who has written lots of New York Times bestsellers. I think he's got 7 now. Blessed Unrest was one of his first, and then Project Drawdown was in 2017, and then he's just recently released a book called Regeneration, which I worked with him on for the last couple of years, and really looking at all sorts of ecosystem restoration and how we could improve it and what we're doing to it and which ones, you know, pull down the most carbon and which ones would, you know, help the Earth's water cycle. And so obviously there's a big chapter in there about insects, because, you know, as many of we are facing an insect Armageddon to a degree. About a third of our insect populations are facing extinction right now. And, you know, I'm sure many of your listeners will understand, but, you know, our pollinators are just so crucial to our food. It's about 85% of our flowering plants require a pollinator now. And some of those are the ones that, you know, it wouldn't be the same world if we couldn't have a world of chocolate and avocado and mangoes and cherries and these type of things. So this is absolutely a crisis we need to address. And like everything we've talked about today, comes back to the systemic architecture of what we've created, and we are decimating them through our habitat destruction, through our food habits, through climate change and changing climate in particular areas. Pesticide use is a massive one, which is again why we need to be moving to more regenerative agriculture practices that are removing, they're not fighting nature and controlling weeds and controlling pests. They're working with nature and the potency of the soil to bring those landscapes back to life and create those habitats for bees and these other pollinators. And one of my close friends up here too is a guy named Cedar Anderson, who had a beautiful invention called the flow hive, which is another way of extracting honey. So we've had one of those in our house for the last 4 years, and has really upscaled our connection to our own bees. And that hum that you talked about before is a hum that I'm very familiar with, and our children are, and they get in there and change the hive regularly and understand how it all works. So I just think what he's done is extraordinary. And, you know, they sell a phenomenal amount of these hives every month to the biggest names in the world that you can think of, that are putting them on their rooftops in suburbs. And there's an opportunity for us to all play a huge role there, because we don't just need our farmlands restored to bring back these habitats, but we can have thriving bee populations in our cities. And we're seeing lots of countries plant, you know, rooftop gardens and flowers, even on bus shelters, to create these habitats for bees. And what we found is that even in our suburb, we've lived in a couple of different places, but we actually got the most honey in our suburbs because of people's flowers in their garden. The honey has been extraordinary in its richness and its flavors. And once we're staying with friends now in a bit more of a rural area, and the honey is very different, and it's taken a little bit longer to get. So, you know, what a great first step for people to take that are living even in city areas, to get one of these very simple hives. The flow hive is literally a tap that you turn and the honey comes out. You don't really need to do any of the smoking and the work, and the bees are still looked after. But it's a very simple step for people to take. And it's not even about owning one yourself. You might want to chip in with 2 or 3 neighbours. I think they're about $700. But what a lovely investment to make as a community. Your street potentially, you know, we get 6 or 7 jars out of it every couple of months, and very big jars. So it's a lovely thing to share, and put it somewhere in your community or on your street. You know, and make that connection with the kids. They love that process, and just to see this mellifluous gold liquid pouring out of this tap every couple of months is an extraordinary thing, and doesn't lose its magic, even for our children. So yeah, that was a bit of a rant, my bee rant, but happy to go further on that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because yesterday I was interviewing the guy that we actually bought our equipment from Australian Bee Supplies. And, you know, he was talking about, you can gauge now with bees down to a community or a postcode, if you will, as to which postcodes are actually doing well by the honey generation that's being done. And he was saying, you know, they expect, if you get hives in an area, in a suburb, so like ours, the growth rate, the pollination rate goes up somewhere around 20%. He believes it's actually more, just on his anecdotal and you know, work, and he's been doing it for 10 years. And so he is at a point now, he can actually tell suburb to suburb just by the quality of the honey that he sees, the quality of the bees, how healthy the bees are.
Yeah.
And if that's not a good indicator to start at home and build out, I really don't know what else there is.
The joy we've found over the 4 years is that each batch, because the flowers are all different, you just get a different flavor each time. And you think, oh, there's a wattle flavor to this, or there's a Banksia here, or that's more of the sort of urban flowers. So it's just, it's a no-brainer, to be honest. And you're probably finding that yourself, but especially for the kids, what a beautiful way to connect them to nature straight away and to get them to understand how their system works, those bees, and teach them some matriarchy too. She's a tough queen, that one. She's got some rules, but we could use a bit more matriarch advice in our system right now as well.
I totally agree. No argument from me. And then we've both known Shirley for a while, and now we know Freya. So, hey, no argument. You wanted to jump in for a second?
Well, I would say that Cedar often tells me, like, he's filmed them up close, but the queen has been known, she literally cuts off the penises of the soldier bees if they haven't done their job. They get kicked out of the hive. They get like, it's a brutal world in the bee, and you don't mess with that queen, that's for sure.
There's that many males, and the rest is all female.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's everything's female apart from the drones.
Yeah.
And the drones' one job is to be born, go fly around, and have a queen.
That's it.
Find them. And it's really interesting. And
they wait around to be fed by everybody.
Well, that's it. The drone was interesting. They have much bigger eyes on a drone, so they can spot a queen, because a queen will travel up to sort of between 5 and 10 kilometres to find a different male to breed with. And so it's fascinating how this all works. So
I'm just excited. I'm going to have my flow hive this weekend.
You're getting it. Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I've got a friend who has one, and the honey is just incredible. And just being able to see, I don't mind the bees. Like, I'll go and stand up with them and chat with them. And I've been researching and writing about bee shamanism, and that was a whole amazing journey. And I was like, yes, I can work with these creatures. They'll come and sit on me and walk on me when I'm in the garden, and I'm fine with that. They're just so sweet.
Yeah, and it's beautiful to watch them find their routes too. When you first put your hive in, you see them sort of all just flurry around, and you can see they're communicating in their own way, and then they start to chart this path of how they're all going to leave the hive and find the flowers. And within a few days, suddenly they've just got this highway that they've developed, and it's just it's extraordinary to watch how they work.
So that brings me back to the fact that we're subjugating them to a lot of control. When you were speaking earlier about, what we're doing around the world and locally and everything, we exploit the bees. Instead of buzzing around the neighbourhood out for the day, collecting different varieties and flowers and adding the beautiful sensations and taste to the honey and enjoying themselves, because that's actually why they're born, to do that. For us, it's a bonus. But of course, we've got the other side of it, where they are slaves, and they are used, and they are sent out so that all they've got to pollinate, because that's all they can go to in that day of flying, is the one flower on these gigantic farms and things. There's just that one flower. There's no diversity. There's no true being of a bee. So, there's the bees they've become slaves to us in many ways. While we're thinking beautiful honeys, we're not realising all the other things we have that are huge conglomerated farm packages. The bees just have that. It's not, and they're killed, they're let die because it's cheaper to send out a new lot. There's a whole lot of bee slavery and everything going on. So we really need to look at everything, isn't it?
Well, we do it to every animal, really. We've set up. We've created a system that's based on monoculture, and all of nature thrives on diversity. And so those two things are clashing, and that is a pathway to self-termination, and that's what's beautiful about things like regenerative agriculture that are emerging again, or agroecology, or these mixed species again of these communities that are planting all sorts of different trees and foods and having animals graze through their networks, because that's what nature does. And suddenly the soil comes alive and thrives. And so that rich soil has more nutrients in it that then gets passed on to the foods or the animals. And we've done the opposite. We've just completely denuded all our soilers of life, and we've sprayed them with chemicals, and we've planted one single rows of one crop. That's not sustainable, you know, and yet it was called the Green Revolution, ironically. You know, that's the opposite of what we need to be doing. And thankfully, there's a huge change. Even in our country, we work with Southern Cross University on this current film, and they said of the 40,000 farmers in Australia, now 10,000 of them are doing either biological farming, organic, or regenerative practices. You know, that's 1 in 4. That's a massive stat. And with the right incentives, a Healthy Soils Act, or more transparency about where our food comes from, that number is going to rise exponentially. In fact, there's a group that we're working with that have developed a system where you can scan a QR code at the supermarket and you'll see not only the supply chain or how the animal was treated, but you'll see the soil health, the nutrient of that food. Once that information becomes available to people, it's going to send a different signal to the farmers, and they're going to be incentivized to grow more and more of that food, and we'll start to close that loop because people will really understand how their food has been grown in the last 40 or 50 years and how it's affected their own bodies and how it's affecting the planet. And really, food has to be on the front line of how we address with our ecological problems, but also, as we know, our health problems. It's a wonderful entry point for people through.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was the biggest thing in 2040.
Oh, sorry, go on, Shirley.
Was just the biggest thing in the 2040 film to me was watching that the farmer, I think, was he out in Shepparton or somewhere, I can't remember. And that was the part that I think I took away the most. It felt local, and the way he was farming and letting it all grow and the animals coming through. I thought that was probably the most pertinent.
Yep. And that's happening right around the world now, and especially in Australia. We've got some of the leaders in the world in this space, and that term has just shot through in the last 2 or 3 years. And there are people now, you know, calling their food regenerative. It's very exciting, and you're right. It gives me the most hope too, because, you know, soil is the foundation of our existence. If we don't get the soil right, we don't exist. So, you know, thankfully, people have started to take that seriously.
And remember when food used to be solely hand-picked, and some of it still is, but the majority is mechanically picked now. And there is no replacement for the relationship of climbing up a tree and picking the mulberries or picking the cherries, or there's that human plant love connection that goes on. And people talked about the different taste in the food. And I know that the pesticides and the herbicides and the fungicides and I've got a lot to do with it, but it's also got to do with the relationship between the human being and the plant. And that will bring a whole lot of nourishment back into the food as well.
I think that's a really good point. One of my COVID projects, Damon, was to build a wire, so a chicken wire enclosed orchard for our place, because we have problems with deer and rabbits and kangaroos and birds, and they all just come in and decimate everything that we grow. And now we try and grow X amount for animals, X amount for ourselves, but the animals are beating us at the minute. But we put a lot of love and effort and time into building that, and then that flows onto the whole garden. And what we're noticing, what I'm noticing, is when you walk through the old gate that we bought from Brighton, front gate that I've hung on these tree posts from the property and all the rest of it, it's sort of like walking into your own microclimate. And it just has this sense of, wow, I could sit here and have a cup of coffee. I could sit here and have a beer. You know, it just is so soothing. And I think it's taken me a while to get into gardening, and I'm certainly not a huge fan. Jane, my other half, is the gardener. And what we're finding is that with the chooks and the ducks and the poo and the water and all the stuff we're doing, you know, with our tanks and solars and all this sort of stuff, the whole place is starting to just get a different feel to it. And, you know, we reuse a lot of the stuff that we've got here and was left here on the property and when we first moved in here. But it's that soil has been a key point in everything growing.
Yeah.
And
you're prioritizing life. That little sanctuary is life, and you've created the conditions for life to emerge again. And it reminds me of that beautiful Albert Schweitzer quote. He said that, you know, I am life that wills to live amidst life that wills to live. You know, and that's the way out of this mess, is to prioritize life and connection over capital. You know, that's what we have to do to turn this around. And you've just described it beautifully. And the feeling you get from being surrounded by life that's being allowed to do the thing that it does best.
Yeah.
You know, that to me is true regeneration. And it starts when people get that feeling in their own place, and then they let that move them forward. That custodianship can then get amplified to the rest of the world.
Yeah, one of the amazing things that I've noticed since we moved here and Jane's got so into the garden is that all our family and friends are now growing stuff. And so we're sharing our veggies, we're sharing our chilies, we're sharing the fruit of that. And so they're all growing too, because they're all asking me, you know, even Shirley was the other day when we were up at her place, and her and Jane were just going 100 miles an hour like this, talking about, you know, how to improve the garden, how to get the veggies working better, how to do this, how to do that. And that's the part of the community that I really enjoy seeing grow, is that sharing of knowledge to help people grow whatever they want, whether it's in a pot plant or a big plot, doesn't matter. So, sorry, Frank, jump in.
No, I was going to ask Damon if he's ever played with a plant music device.
Plant music device.
Oh, I'm so excited for you now.
No, tell me more. I've got an idea in my head, but tell me more.
Okay,
So,
I'll send you a link to one of our podcasts that we had a beautiful flower playing music. Go, Freya, you can do it.
So we had Alison Jarrett on a couple of months back, and she's just amazing and gorgeous, and she is the representative for Damon Gameau in Australia. And Damon Gameau is a community that sprung up in Italy, and they created this incredible device which you can clip one part onto the leaf and the other part onto the root of the plant, and then it talks to you. You would love it so much.
Can I get one of these machines? Are these
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, send you the link.
Available.
Yeah, and it's amazing because in the healing center that I ran, I had my one of my golden palms, Delilah, connected up, and she would get involved in the conversations with the people who I was talking to about changing their diet and things to do for their body to reconnect and bring themselves into a holistic relationship with nature again. And Delilah would be like, dun dun, if they were saying something. And then on the other hand, if she was liking something, she'd be like, da la 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 la. And this was how I lived. And my plants would wake me up at 4:30 in the morning. So I didn't have to have an alarm if I was still busy in dream work. Or they'd, you know, and they just sing. Sometimes they go quiet, and then we'd play concerts and they'd go quiet, and then I'd invoke and then start playing the crystal bowls, and then they'd burst into song with me. It is the most incredible relationship. I just feel like all teary now, but it's the most incredible thing to be that connected to the plants. And you can take them into your garden, and then you can talk to the plants that are growing and how, you know, how they're feeling, and you know, and who's going well and who's not, and you just get this incredible relationship with them. You can ask them questions and everything. Everyone should get one.
What sound come back? Is it a vibration? Are they really
it could really
sounds? Are they hums?
You can program it. So you can program it to be a different musical instrument, right? So you'll find as you get to work with your plant, because they've never spoken, they've never heard themselves speak before. And as soon as they understand that they can speak, it will take them a minute to get the hang of it. And they'll test out the sound. And then as, you know, you give them permission to do that, then they'll get, some of them are very chatty, some of them are very quiet, some of them very, like, it's a whole nother realm of imagining. And I perceive the world with, you know, with cities which have plants that can communicate, and gardens that plants can communicate, and walkways and corridors where you can walk through our forests and have these plants talking to people, so that we can move into another whole paradigm of truth and beauty. Yeah. Look, I can see you're going to have 10 of them shortly.
There's going to be a few. Alison was explaining to us in the interview that there was a vegetarian restaurant that opened up, and they had these plant machines in there. And while I was setting up the restaurant, they were singing and talking and communicating beautifully. And of course, when they opened the restaurant and they started cutting the food, everything went quiet and they couldn't work out what it was. And so someone went in there and actually said, well, have you actually honoured the food that you're taking from these plants? They want to give it to us. If we don't honour it, how are they going to do it? And they said, right, so now we do a prayer every time we have the food, and the plants started singing again. So there's a real consciousness in plants, and you alluded to that earlier in the conversation.
I feel another documentary coming on.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking of starting a band with a few different plants and seeing what, yeah.
Well, that is not uncommon. Like I said, I'll send you through the link. People can actually, any listeners, if you go to Supernal Magazine Australia.com.au, go to our podcasts and have a look at the one from Alison Jarrett, or check out the issue that she features in, which is, I think that was in Informed Consent, the last issue, wasn't it? Yeah, so that was in the October-November issue, Informed Consent. And so all the links and everything are in there as well. You know, I know that our time is pretty much done, Damon, and I really do appreciate giving us your precious time at the moment with getting everything ready. It's been really good and lovely to sort of see you in person while we're talking rather than just over the phone. I think, you know, it's a much better connection for me when I can see people and talk to them. That's how I am.
Yeah, I'd love to do when the film's out, let's do something else, or get involved in the screening as well, because it's going to be really great conversation. And I mean, even Shirley from Mornington Peninsula, I mean, as you know, there are already some terrific initiatives. In fact, they're leading the country in a lot of ways with some of their ambitions as a council. So yeah, there will definitely be screenings down there. So let's see if we can meet up again and have another chat. And who knows, maybe even wire some plants up on stage and amplify the voices.
Yep.
I'm going to look into that.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Look, they are music. You know, for someone like myself who's a muso, I love just sitting around and playing a flute or drums or whatever. And, you know, the plants just respond so beautifully. Animals respond. People respond. We're all a consciousness and we're all connected. So, you know, there's that beehive sort of thing. We're all individual, yet we're all connected. And that's the message.
You all, and congrats on the terrific work that you do. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thanks for your time as well.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been our pleasure. Absolutely.
Truly.
So, Damon, thank you very much. And we'll talk to you soon, and I'll send those links across for you too.
Take care.
Bless.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Ian. Bye. One.com.au, and you can go to drn1.com.au, of course, and get onto Life, and you can listen to our podcast. You can listen to health and wellbeing music 24/7 and some other great shows that are on. And so, yeah, I think what a fantastic show and episode for this. And thank you, Freya, and thank you, Shirley.
Thank you, Shirley.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Anthony.
Nice to catch up.
Excellent.
Always.
We'll have a supernal week, everybody, and we shall talk soon. Ciao.
Ciao.